Good morning, everyone. My name is Judy Wolf-Bolton. I am the CEO of the Ocean Marine JCC. We're so delighted to have you all back, or hopefully some new people too. And mostly we're delighted to be once again on a briefing with Avi Melamed. Avi has been providing invaluable education for our community around Israel and the Middle East for really it's 2 years now since October 23. And we are really grateful to have this time to be able to continue our learning with Avi. Uh, Before I introduce Avi, one piece of um, housekeeping is that there is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screens for all of our participants. You can submit questions that you would like to have considered at any point during the briefing, and then we are able to compile and combine those together. So please feel free to put any kind of question you want in the Q&A at the bottom. Okay, so happy to once again welcome Avi. Avi is a distinguished geopolitical Middle East expert, an intelligence analyst, and the founder and CEO of Inside the Middle East Intelligence Perspectives ITIM. He is a former Israeli intelligence officer and senior advisor on Arab affairs and has been doing these types of trainings live and online with so many different sources and so many different people all over the world. So we are really honored, once again, Avi, to welcome you to the Marin JCC.
Judy, thank you so much for this very kind introduction. Rachel, Alisa, thank you so much for your cooperation, making this yet another, I hope, significant educational opportunity. Shalom and hello to all my friends at the Ocean Marine JCC. It's always my pleasure. Well, talking about the Middle East, as we always say, never a dull moment in our region. And today I would like to focus on a couple of arenas, four different arenas to be more precise, which to a certain extent have some things in common. So in the next 30 minutes or so, I will shortly try to share with you some recent perspectives on those arenas, and of course, very much looking forward to your questions. I'm starting with Gaza Strip, a very significant development in the context of Gaza Strip. A couple of days ago, the United Nations Security Council adopted Resolution 2803, actually adopting President Trump's Gaza peace deal. Some background. A couple of weeks ago, President Trump published this plan, and actually there has been a big conference with the participation of regional players, not including Israel, but including Turkey and Qatar and Saudi Arabia, Egypt, United Arab Emirates, and Jordan and others, who formally adopted President Trump Gaza peace deal. And now the United Nations Security Council formally approved it and adopted it as well. This is very significant. We'll shortly try to understand very shortly what's the significance potentially of the deal and the United Nations Security Council resolution. But first, let's look at the map that you see in front of you that shows you Gaza Strip. Reminder, Gaza Strip, very small area, 8 by 20 miles. Since 2007, Gaza Strip has been governed by Hamas, Islamic Palestinian movement that was established in Gaza Strip in the late 1980s. The red strip that you see in front of you basically represents current Israeli military presence in Gaza Strip. That military presence is actually part of the Trump deal, Trump Gaza peace deal, and actually also being part of the current United Nations Security Council resolution. The importance of that deal and of course, the fact that it has been adopted by the United Nations Security Council lies in a couple of different aspects. First, this is the first time that actually regional players, namely mostly Arab states, but also Turkey, are now formally committed to have skin in the game in the context of Gaza Strip. Since Hamas took over Gaza Strip back in 2007, dragging Gaza Strip to repeating military rounds with Israel, and each one is more severe than the one before, To a large extent, the regional players and mostly the Arab states were standing on the sideline, basically just here and there, mostly engaged in rhetoric or statements and so on. And for good reasons, to a large extent, because they realized that there is no real much place for proactive involvement in the situation in Gaza Strip as long as Hamas and its axis of resistance fellows like Hezbollah and others were so powerful the way they used to be before October 7. But now things have changed following October 7, following the war, following the military defeat of Hamas and Hezbollah. And so now regional players are committed to have a skin in the game, which is, of course, as for itself, a positive development. The interesting thing about the United Nations Security Council resolution that it actually internationalized in a way the situation in Gaza Strip because it adopts the component of the program that talks about the establishment of the ISF, International Stabilization Force. We are actually looking at an effort that is led by United States, Israel, and Egypt to address the situation in Gaza Strip, to create a new conditions on the ground, sort of speaking. You could see in front of you some of the tasks of this body or this entity called ISF. Obviously, one of the most significant things that we should take into consideration is the fact that Hamas is demanded now formally, including under the decision of the United Nations Security Council, to disarm itself as a condition for further development and rebuilding and stability and building stability in Gaza Strip. Another significant component of the plan and the resolution is the body that is called the US-led Board of Peace. This is actually supposed to be the steering committee, sort of speaking, under the leadership of the United States with the participation of major regional players, including Muslim states that are not from the region, that will proactively be involved in addressing the different needs of Gaza Strip as part of the rehabilitation of Gaza Strip and part of building conditions towards what hopefully, according to the United Nations resolution, will lead further on to conditions and scaffoldings that will enable creation of Palestinian self-rule and statehood. So as for itself, this whole development is quite substantial. However, we should note that the path ahead is paved with huge question marks, big question marks. To what extent it can be really implemented on the ground? One of the major obstacles, of course, is the issue of Hamas weapon. Hamas refused to disarm itself, arguing that this is the weapon of the resistance. And not surprisingly, Hamas basically rejected United Nations Security Council. But the big issue, of course, in the end of the day, who is going to dismantle Hamas military capacities? Because this is a condition for further development and further rehabilitation of Gaza Strip. In fact, Saudi Arabia, United Arab Emirates, the major Arab players who are expected to be the deep pockets financing the rehabilitation of Gaza Strip, estimated at some $70 billion. They made it very clear that they are not going to put a dollar as long as Hamas is not disarming itself. So this is one major obstacle that has to be addressed. Israel made it very clear that as far as it's concerned, Hamas must be disarmed one way or another, meaning that potentially if the diplomatic efforts are not going to be successful, we could not exclude the possibility of resuming of the fight in Gaza Strip when Israel will move forward to dismantle Hamas remaining military capacities, and there are still some significant military capacities remain. Another significant challenge is the question of the reform within the Palestinian Authority as a condition for moving forward to restore its control in Gaza Strip. Yet again, a big question mark to what extent such reform can take place and to what extent it should be or will be or could be an effective reform. These are all open questions that still, of course, we have to follow and see how things will evolve and develop down the road. However, This is a very significant moment in the context of the story of Gaza, and to a large extent also in the context of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, because actually, for the first time, the most significant international forum, United Nations Security Council, is actually internationalizing, in a way, the story of Gaza Strip, which is, of course, as for itself, a very dramatic milestone in the context of the story of the conflict. Turning our look to another arena, this time to the north of Israel, and this is Lebanon. Lebanon is engaged for the last couple of months with in growing inner debate and concerns vis-à-vis the whole issue of the disarmament of the Hezbollah. Similar to the story of Hamas, like in Lebanon, there is a clear international demand from Hezbollah to disarm itself. Not surprisingly, the Hezbollah refuses to disarm itself, and in fact, has been trying and is trying constantly to regroup following its defeat in the war with Israel. What we are looking today in Lebanon is growing tensions, growing concerns. The Lebanese government, for the first time ever, since actually Hezbollah emerged in the beginning of the 1980s, the Lebanese government formally demanded the Hezbollah to disarm itself, and the Lebanese government formally instructed the Lebanese army to disarm, to prepare a plan for the disarmament of the Hezbollah. No one has illusions about it. The Lebanese army is unlikely able to do something like that. Hezbollah on its side is starting to send more and more threats, threatening that any attempt to disarm the organization will result in significant ramifications and repercussions for Lebanon. In other words, the Hezbollah is actually threatening a civil war. Only the other day, the Lebanese president, Joseph Aoun, that was previously the chief of staff of the Lebanese army, he made a very strong statement addressing the Hezbollah, sending the message that says, Lebanon is a state and that there is only one state in Lebanon and there is only one government and there is only one army in Lebanon. But it goes back to the old ongoing debate regarding the disarmament of the Hezbollah. So again, this is a very significant and critical and delicate moment in the context of Lebanon. Israel is monitoring and intercepting the attempts of the Hezbollah to rebuild itself. Recently, there has been intensification of the Israeli military actions. Israeli maintained military presence in South Lebanon in 5 different locations, and Israel constantly has been pounding and attacking Hezbollah's following the ceasefire agreement that was signed a year ago. Israel is determined to prevent from the Hezbollah to rebuild its military infrastructure and to repose the significant threat it presented to Israel. At the same time, Israel also noticed that the Iranian regime is resuming efforts to rebuild the power of the Hezbollah in Lebanon. All in all, when we look at the Lebanese arena at this point, growing tensions, very, very delicate times. There are growing concerns that we may see the resume of the fight between Israel and the Hezbollah. We'll have to continue and watch that arena. One interesting update on that regard, the United States just recently announced or nominated a new ambassador to Lebanon. This person is originally Lebanese, Christian Lebanese. He's a businessman in the States, but he is originally from Lebanon. And it's very interesting because obviously he is very much familiar with the Lebanese arena, obviously speaks the language, knows the player involved. So it will be very interesting whether the US ambassador to Lebanon will be able to navigate this very, very complicated political arena. Just the same, pay attention to the situation in Lebanon, very, very sensitive at this moment. We cannot exclude the possibility of the resuming of the fight between Israel and the Hezbollah. Pay attention to this arena as well. As you can understand, the common denominator, Hamas in Gaza Strip, Hezbollah in Lebanon, both are partners to this axis of resistance that we have very much talked about in previous sessions, this Iranian-backed radical axis that has inflicted an enormous destruction and death across the Middle East for the last 4 decades. Both Hamas and Hezbollah sustained military defeat in the war with Israel, and both Hamas and Hezbollah are opposing, rejecting the demand, the international demand, the regional demand, the local demand to disarm themselves. So this is a power struggle, which the outcomes of that power struggle, as you can understand, have an enormously significant ramifications and repercussions, regionally, domestically, regionally, and even beyond the region. Let's look at another Arab state, Iraq. Similar to Gaza and Lebanon, in Iraq, we also find the situation of semi-state entities in the shape of Iraqi Shiite militias. You see in front of you the logos of some of those militias that are formed in a structure that is called Al-Hashd al-Sha'bi, the PMU, the Popular Mobilization Units. The story of those militias is fascinating. Back then, in the early 2000s, when ISIS emerged in the Sunni part of Iraq, Iraq has three major communities. Majority of Iraqis are Shiites, about 65%. Then you got a group of some 20 something percent, 25 or a little bit more of Sunnis in Iraq, and then other minorities like Turkmen, Yazidis, and others. When Sunni ISIS emerged in Iraq in the beginning of the 2000s, an Iraqi Shiite clergy, which considered to be maybe the highest source of authority, spiritually speaking, religiously speaking, for the Shiites. His name is Ayatollah Uzma Ali al-Sistani, who lives in Iraq. He is, by the way, originally Iranian, but he has been living most of his life in Iraq, in the south part of Iraq. The south part of Iraq is hosting the most holy sites of the Shiites, the Shiite Muslims in the cities of Najaf and Kerbala. And Ali al-Sistani issued back there in the beginning of 2000 a religious ordinance called Fatwa, basically calling for Iraqi males to grab weapons and to fight against ISIS inside Iraq. That resulted in the formation of those militias that later on some of those militias are basically going to be hijacked, quote unquote, by the Iranian regime. And to a large extent, those militias, some of those militias became to a large extent an Iranian extension inside Iraq, and they are enormously powerful. They are powerful because first, they have a military power, and second, parallel to that military power, they also have a political representation in the form of political parties that is basically forming the current Iraqi government. The current Iraqi government is the major power within this government is known as the Shiite framework. And that Shiite framework, which of course represents in the end of the day that majority of the population in Iraq are Shiites, that Shiite framework includes also the political parties of those militias who are to a large extent acting as an Iranian proxies inside Iraq. Couple of days ago, there has been general elections in Iraq. Iraq is a nation of some 40 million people. The elections in Iraq are based upon districts. There are many districts in Iraq, and the Iraqi parliament is a total of 329 seats. The outcome of the elections is very interesting, significant, yet to a large extent not so much surprising. One major outcome of the elections in Iraq is the fact that today, not surprisingly, more than 50% of the seats in the parliaments are taken by Shiite affiliated factors. Another significant effect is the fact that, not surprising again, that the Iranian-backed Shiite militias and their political parties maintain their power in the current Iraqi government, which basically means that in the end of the day, Iran has a lot of influence within the Iraqi government. In that regard, I should mention something interesting, and that is the fact that a very powerful political leader in Iraq, his name is Muqtada al-Sadr, who is also Shiite from the south, boycott the elections. It's interesting because in the recent elections, This person, al-Sadr, and his camp won the majority of were the biggest political party in the Iraqi parliament with something like 74 seats. However, back then, he, for different reasons, ordered the members of the parliament that belongs to his party, he ordered them to resign, and they resigned the government. And ever since then, he has been boycotting the elections in Iraq. It's interesting because this person, Muqtada al-Sadr, is like a chameleon. He has been playing all across the board. He was once with the Iranians, and then he became anti-Iranian, and he was once anti-American, and then he was playing balls with other factors. Very sophisticated, very opportunistic, and a lot of political power. And so he boycotted the elections. And he boycotted the elections, basically arguing that the Iraqi system is so corrupted and it's so beyond repair that the elections, even though have been held, roughly speaking, in a democratic way, the elections are basically totally a waste of time. It doesn't really address the needs of the Iraqi people. It basically reflects merely the needs and interests of individuals and local political parties. To a large extent, he is right. In fact, and it's a known secret, let's put it this way, in Iraq, political parties, and there are endless numbers of lists and political figures, locally and regionally and in a district level in Iraq that are involved in the elections. Everybody knows that money is simply paid to buy voters' support. That fact is a well-known fact in Iraq. And one of the interesting aspects of that is that obviously the Iraqi political system is to a large extent tuned or subscribed to the interest of local, kind of like, influential people in the districts. It is basically involved a lot of corruption, inevitably. It's a politics that basically is a very sectarian one, on both on levels of ethnicities, origin, geographical area, of course, the religious denomination, whether you are Sunni or you are Shiite or you are Kurd, and so on. And so, all in all, when we're looking at the Iraqi political system, we're looking at a system that is, to a large extent, first, very complicated and complex, and second, very much is inflicted or infected, sort of speaking, with a lot of corruption and disefficiency and so on and so on. In fact, Iraq has been struggling enormously with a variety of economic, social, political challenges. And one of the tragic things about Iraq is that Iraq could have been potentially heaven. I mean, this is one of the biggest, largest manufacturers of oil in the world, and has an enormous oil and gas wealth. However, the money has been, simply to put it, looted by a very greedy politicians. There has been claims inside the Iraqi public discussion that some $1 trillion were basically looted all those years by Iraqi politicians. Obviously, of course, I don't know to say if that number is accurate, but it's clearly there is an enormous, across the board, terrible corruption that characterizes the Iraqi political system. And indeed, when you look at the challenges of Iraq in terms of the neglectance, like lack of infrastructure, lack of services, high rates of unemployment, and many other challenges, it is very tragic to see how a state that could have been and should have been heaven basically is to a large extent hell. Um, One other challenge that characterizes the Iraqi politics and society is the spread of weapons in the heads of people. In every household, you basically could find weapon. And obviously, you can understand when, in such reality and under those circumstances and conditions, one could not expect a very stable, let's put it, and law-abiding society. So there are many, many challenges in Iraq that adds to the whole challenges of the corrupted, multi-sectarian, multi-ethnical political system. It's a very much fractured system, as the title says for itself. One other interesting outcome of the elections in Iraq is the defeat, the agonizing defeat of the civil society parties. There has been a couple of civil society affiliated parties operating in the frame of coalitions. They have totally and utterly failed. Their failure is attributed to the corruption of the system, the fact that they didn't really have an access to the wealth, so they could not buy or bribe voters, which for itself is kind of like an ironic argument when you think about the civil society affiliated factors. Another reason for their failure is the inner power struggle within those parties. Another reason is the end of the day that, as I said before, the elections are on a domestic district base, and the loyalty of people is first and foremost given to the local politicians who are expected to serve their own immediate, narrow political interests. So, all in all, it's very clear that civil society, at least currently camp in Iraq, has been significantly defeated, which is very interesting because when you look at other states in the region, you definitely can see the strengthening of civil society camp. You can see that in Jordan and in Lebanon, in Morocco, in Tunisia, in Algeria, in other places, in Egypt. Yet in Iraq, it has been totally defeated, which says a lot about, of course, the characteristics of the Iraqi society and its political structure. Finally, given the fact that the Iraqi parliament today is structured between so many different coalitions and parties, in order to have a government, you have to assemble a coalition. None of the parties in Iraq has enough power for itself to assemble coalition. In that regard, it's very much similar to the Israeli parliamentary system that also calls for a minimum of votes, seats in the parliament in order to be able to assemble a government. In Israel, it's calling for 61 seats out of 120 seats of the parliament. And so in Israel, for example, almost constantly government are formed based upon coalition, meaning different parties that are coming together and willingly are forming the government. Something similar is characterizing the Iraqi government. In the previous elections, for example, it took almost a year until the Iraqi parliament was able, in the end of the day, to assemble government. This time, observers think that we may see the similar picture in Iraq. It will take a long time to assemble a government while the Iraqi state is fighting or challenging an enormous challenges, as I mentioned before. All those things together, of course, are basically could indicate that Iraq is continuing its very turbulent path ahead. Again, we are looking at one of the most significant countries in the region, so therefore there is a lot of need to follow very closely the story of Iraq. One other thing in the context of Iraq that is basically bridging us to the final arena, which is Iran, has to do with one of the major challenges of Iraq, and this is the story of water. Iraq is the country of the two rivers, meaning the Euphrates and the Tigris, that has been always the vein of life of Iraq. In last years, those two rivers are drying out. One of the major reasons for that, other than a drought, is the fact that Turkey built huge dams inside Turkey, basically narrowing the flow of the rivers coming from Turkey. Those two rivers are actually coming from Turkey, crossing through Syria and going to Iraq and ending up down in the Shat al-Arab area next to Kuwait. The rivers, those two rivers, it's a painful sight to see those rivers today. It's a terrible situation. They're basically drying up, and the ramifications are enormous in many different ways, environmentally, economically, socially. Agriculture in Iraq is basically collapsing. Large areas in Iraq became non-feasible for agricultural purpose and so on. And this is an enormous challenge that Iraq is facing. It fuels, as you can understand, a lot of tension between Iraq and Turkey. And this is also one of the major things to follow very closely in the context of Iraq. And talking about water basically leads me to the final arena today, and this is Iraq's neighbor to the east, Iran. Iran is facing an enormous challenge, water crisis, among many other crises that this enormous state is dealing with, enormous both in terms of land and in terms of population, some 85 million people nation. Iran is simply drying out in an alarming pace. The other day, actually, in reports indicates that the major reservoirs of Iran are basically running dry. The major reserves of Tehran, the capital of Iran, is basically becoming non-functional. Recent documentation from this reservoir indicates it's totally almost dried up. We're looking at a catastrophe, an environmental catastrophe all across Iran. You see the map in front of you that indicates the areas of the drought. To the point, about 10 days ago, the Iraqi president addressed the people of Iran and particularly the people of Tehran, saying, if the situation continues like that and we won't have a rainfall, we will have to start evacuating parts of Tehran. We are looking at an enormously environmental crisis with huge ramifications, as you could understand. I mentioned earlier Iraq and its struggle. The struggle in Iran, I would even say, is much more severe. Uh, Simply to say that people don't have water to drink. In areas in Iraq, in Iran, there are strict restrictions of consumption of water. There is a shortcut of water supply. There is a long shortcuts of supplying of waters permanently in different areas of Iran. People are moving from one way to another because there is no any longer water security. There are different reasons for this enormous crisis that Iran is dealing with. Partly is natural reasons like an ongoing drought. Iran is a semi-arid state and it has been suffering from a severe lack of rainfalls in the last years that has been a cumulative impact. The Iranian regime built over the years many dams inside Iran to contain waters, but actually it appeared, according to the reports and studies, that that has been boomeranging on the Iranian water system uh, because of different reasons, like evacuation of water, waters that basically have been totally lost and not consumed, billions and billions of dollars that have been spent on those systems that in the end of the day basically result in the totally opposite outcome. The ramifications, as you could understand, are enormous. It resulted in a massive migration and collapse of agricultural communities. It increases an enormously pressure on the cities, the major urban areas in Iran, the big cities, Isfahan, Tehran, Khorramshahr, and other places in Iran are already struggling with lots and lots and lots of ripple effects, partly connected to this crisis of water. Iran, one of the major challenges also has to do with Iran's eastern neighbor, which is Afghanistan. Afghanistan, there are some major rivers, and particularly a giant river called Hamel that is coming from Afghanistan to Iran. Has been a major water source for the Iranians. The Afghan government built a dam on this river and now demands the Iranians to pay fees for the water. All in all, when you look at the story of the water crisis in Iran, definitely a big story. Uh, some people said that we may witness the downfall of the Iranian regime as an outcome not of a sanctions and not of a war, but as an outcome of an impact of an environmental, dramatic and drastic phenomenon. And obviously, this is yet another significant thing to follow very closely. By the way, a couple of days ago, the Mullah regime arranged mass prayers for hoping that the sky will open up and there will be rainfall. The Iranians started to seed clouds, and that resulted in, at least in some parts of West Iran, some waterfall, which resulted in, again, ironically, huge floods, basically resulting in the flee of people from areas that have been flooded. The Mullah regime is totally unable to take care of the challenges. And all in all, as you can understand, an increasing enormous challenges inside Iran. The story of the water, the crisis of the water, let alone other challenges like electricity and lack of services, all those things together definitely could result in some very significant, accumulative, huge impact inside Iran. Some experts do not exclude the possibility that it will result in the downfall of the mullah regime in Tehran. Obviously, of course, we will have to follow developments very closely. With this, ladies and gentlemen, I've been covering my quick brief on four arenas: Gaza Strip, Lebanon, Iraq, and Iran, and opening this session to your questions.
Thank you so much, Avi. That was really interesting. You did cover a lot in just a short time. It only reminds me how much I still don't know, even though I follow the news. So again, I'm sure others join me. Very helpful to have your perspectives. So we do have some questions. I'm going to go ahead and read I'm going to go in order here. So the first one is, what do you know about the shooting of peacekeepers recently by Israel? I'm reading it exactly as it is.
Yeah, well, that's a very simple question. I do not know. So
Okay. Okay.
I'm
Let's,
always saying about myself that I'm a very exceptional Israeli because if I don't know an answer, I'm just saying I don't know.
that is exceptional. We appreciate it. Okay. This is from Frank. If Arab countries will not rehabilitate Gaza until Hamas is removed, and Hamas will not disarm, how does the disarming of Hamas and removal happen? Does this fall exclusively on Israel? Else may assist?
Well, definitely that is one of the most possible scenarios. Israel
Yes.
basically said it very clearly. If nobody is going to disarm Hamas, we will disarm Hamas. And
Yep.
Prime Minister Netanyahu said the other day, Hamas is going to disarm whether in a good way or in a bad way. So that's a very likely scenario. That's the reason I said that we may witness the resume of the fight in Gaza Strip.
Right. Okay. Next one is regarding Gaza. I'm wondering about the Israeli settlers' part in the plans regarding Gaza.
Well, the Israeli ultranational right wing, of which the Israeli settlement movement is part of, ideologically and politically, that camp aspires or envisions the return of Israel to Gaza and the return of the rebuilding of Israeli settlements in Gaza Strip as it used to be before 2005. I would say that across the board, clearly, majority of Israelis do not identify with that vision. Majority of the Israelis don't want to go back to Gaza or to rule Gaza, let alone to build settlements in Gaza Strip. But this is an ideology and political objectives of the Israeli ultranational right wing, which is currently a very powerful component in the current Israeli government. Yet the bottom line is that the government itself, in the end of the day, is not going to follow that vision, and so that's the situation.
Okay. Okay, next one. Could you say a little bit more about the 21-point plan, the atmosphere in Israel post the hostage release, and sentiments about the ceasefire?
Well, obviously, as you know, there has been a great relief in Israel with the release of the hostages, or the live one, and most of the ones that were killed or died in captivity. We still don't have all of them back home. We are still missing a couple of dead hostages that need to be brought back to burials in Israel. In that regard, I would say across the board in Israel, there is a lot of appreciation to President Trump. The common outlook in Israel is that it's thanks to President Trump and his pressure and initiative that we saw the hostages released and coming back home. As of the story of the President Trump deals itself, as I said before, on the one hand, it has a lot of significant aspects in the sense that it brings regional players to have formally skin in the game. It brought now the United Nations Security Council to back it formally. Um, it basically portrayed at least potentially a path ahead for rebuilding or reestablishing of Gaza Strip on the one hand, and potentially, hopefully, creating conditions on the ground that basically will create a new page in the story of Gaza Strip in the sense that Gaza Strip will not any longer be a source of constant instability and violence. That said, as I said before in my presentation, there are so many question marks, and Israelis, to a large extent, I would say, express something that goes between skepticism and realism. Many Israelis are basically saying it seems like that in the end of the day, Israel will have to dismantle Hamas itself, which means resuming of the war. It's interesting, by the way, in that regard, to see the inner conversation within Hamas, because there is a lot of pressure on Hamas, as you could understand, from the Palestinians, from the Arab world, and so on, and the international community to disarm itself. So there is a growing tension within Hamas over this whole thing of the disarmament. The common assumption is that there will be some sort of like a formula that, in a way of kind of like what we call belly dancing, a formula that will enable, on the one hand, to have some sort of like disarmament of Hamas, but on the other hand, Hamas will continue to maintain some sort of like military capacities so it could keep face. By the way, the most recent thing in that regard, Hamas basically offered the Palestinian Authority to keep the weapon, that Hamas will hand it over the weapon as a deposit for the Palestinian Authority. The Palestinian Authority rejected it, and needless to say, of course, other factors rejected it as well. So the whole story of Hamas disarmament is enormously significant. Then you have the story of the ruling of Gaza Strip.
Mm-hmm.
This mechanism that is basically supposed to act into rebuild the services in Gaza Strip. Once again, who is going to do that job? Who is going to make sure that Hamas will not, and Hamas is currently through the back door, will resume its control over Gaza Strip through this mechanism? Who is
Yeah.
going to make sure that the services are going to be provided and developed? These are all enormous questions. And in the end of the day, it all starts and ends with the story of Hamas disarmament, because this is the major obstacle. As you mentioned, Judy, the Saudis, the Emiratis are saying, we are not going to invest in Gaza Strip as long as Hamas is not disarming itself. In that regard, it's very interesting. Right now, the Saudi heir, Mohammed bin Salman, is visiting the United States, held meeting with the Trump administration, Trump and his people. And one of the things definitely discussed is the story of the Saudi involvement in the context of Gaza Strip. I expect that the Saudis basically will tell Trump what he already knows, that they are not going to invest billions unless there is going to be some sort of significant development in the context of the disarmament of Hamas.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
I have a couple of new ones here going in a different direction. You might have touched on this, I'm not sure. Iran has increased their morality police. Will this make it harder for the regime to become more Western oriented?
Well, it's very interesting. I don't know what to say about increasing the morality police. Why do I say it's interesting? Because recently, more and more, there are reports coming from Iran overtly documenting what seems to be like growing westernization of the streets, in the sense
Mm,
that we see more and more young women walking around without wearing this scarf
yeah,
to cover
yeah.
their head, the hijab. I just recently saw some rock concerts
Mm,
that were organized on a street level with hundreds of people attending. Interesting phenomenon that I saw recently. The Iranian regime inaugurated some kind of like a sculpture
mm,
that basically documents the early history of Iran before Islam, which
mm.
is very interesting because
Yeah.
there has been always a tension between the Islamic identity of Iran and the Persian pre-Islamic identity. And that was a big ceremony with,
Hmm.
the whole shebang, the whole, fire stuff and all those things going on. And it was very interesting to see that. Is it indicating that the mullah regime at this point is picking its battles and basically refer from strictly enforcing its ideology on the street? Maybe so. It looks like something very interesting, very puzzling to watch that. But again, I have been mostly intrigued by these overt documentations coming from Iran that you just, in a way, it kind of like resembles the days of the pre-Mullah regime when at least the big cities were very much westernized in the outlook. So it's a very interesting development.
Hmm.
One of the things to follow as well.
Yeah. Here's a related question to Iran. I thought this was interesting. Do either Iraq or Iran ever converse indirectly with Israel about its desalination schemes that might help them?
Well, it's interesting. I just saw an interview with a colleague of mine who specializes in Iran. He was asked exactly about that. Why did the
Hmm.
Iranian regime, who spent billions and billions and billions in all kind of destructive capacities, and continue to spend lots of money on missiles and whatever, why didn't the Iranian regime deal with the desalination projects? And
Yeah.
so one of the answers that he gave was that they basically thought that this whole system of dams that they have been building enormously in Iran. They
Hmm.
spend a lot of money on those systems of them. They really thought that that will be the answer for the challenge.
Hmm.
Basically, totally boomerang them. But that's one reason. The other reason he said that he simply doesn't know. I mean, in the sense that, why don't they use or import or buy
Right.
desalination capacities? By the way, that not only Israel, of course, is the one, that there are many factors in the world that can provide desalination solutions. The same applies as for Iraq. In Iraq, again, and also in Iran, it goes back, among other things, to the issue of the corruption. By the way, in the context of Iraq, it's terrible. I mean, it's like in both places, it's terrible. But in Iraq, you see the immediate impact on the environment when you see these whole huge areas that are drying up.
Yeah.
The fishing industry is dying. The agricultural field is totally destroyed. The ramifications are simply enormous.
Okay, I'm going to try to ask this question. Uh, I'm not sure if I'm going to say it right, but what is the UNIFIL's overall role in Israel and Lebanon?
UNIFIL is the United Nations International Force deployed in
Ah,
Lebanon. This is a force that has been deployed following the 2006 war between Israel and the Hezbollah, based upon United Nations Security Council Resolution 1701. The interesting thing about UNIFIL is that we got similar UN force of observers in the Golan Heights. The observers, like their name, are observers. They don't have a military power, and they don't mandate to act militarily to impose the decision of the United Nations Security Council. UNIFIL in Lebanon is composed of military units of different nations. Spain, Ireland, Chile, and India, and other places, and they do have a mandate to act militarily to impose the orders of the Security Council 1701 decision. They, roughly speaking, didn't do that. They didn't really confront Hezbollah in the south part of Lebanon. And actually, what happened was that beneath their nose, sort of speaking, of UNIFIL in South Lebanon, the Hezbollah was rebuilding and restructuring its power in South Lebanon following 2006. You could see more than once, you see in South Lebanon, you could see a post of UNIFIL, and next to that, a post of the Lebanese army, quote unquote, which basically was manned by the Hezbollah. And you see in the last couple of years, the Hezbollah was totally defying overtly the 1701 instructions when the Hezbollah was overtly deployed again in the south part of Lebanon. So that is the story of UNIFIL.
Okay. Okay, I wanted to ask this one. How effective do you think the US and Israeli strikes on Iranian nuclear sites were? If they weren't effective, does that increase the danger of Iran getting a nuclear weapon soon?
Well, I should say that my assessment is just as good as yours because I'm totally relying upon what come across. I don't have, of course, any inside information. To the best of my understanding and knowledge, uh, I would say there is consensus that there has been some significant damage caused to the Iranian nuclear program. It varies in to what extent and what was the depth of the damage, and is it for 2 years or 5 years or delaying or postponing or whatever. So I have no ability, of course, to evaluate accurately the scale of the damage and the impact of the damage. I would say that it seems like, according to the most of the estimations, that there has been some significant damage caused to the Iranian nuclear program. The Iranians, following that, since then, what happened, the most significant thing was that the European states that were partnering to the JCPOA agreement from 2015 um, reactivated the snapback mechanism. This is the mechanism that has been included in the agreement, basically resuming sanctions on Iran for its lacking of complying with the international demands and the agreement itself. The Iranians constantly formally are saying we are not looking to have a nuclear military capacity. We have the right to develop a nuclear capacities for civilian purposes. As we all know, there are some very good reasons to doubt the authenticity and to what extent the Iranian regime is honest about it. It must be much, much more better to be much more skeptic and suspicious than believing the Mullah regime in that regard. So right now we are in a phase where there's supposed to be resuming of talks in the end of the day between the regime and the Western powers, and particularly the United States administration. And interesting enough, the United States signals the Iranians that there is a place to go back to the negotiations, and the United States is willing to be receptive or listen to the Iranians' perspectives. But as of now, the Iranians are continuing to play all around the board or the field, both rejecting as well as hinting that they are willing to go back. One way or another, we have to follow that development. We have to remind ourselves again the story of the Iranian ballistic missiles. The
Mhm.
Iranians are trying to rebuild, and they are saying that very overtly, not only to rebuild, but to further intensify their missiles capacities, the missiles and the long-term ballistic missiles. They have recently started to make threats against Israel, basically saying the next war, it will be thousands of missiles raining down on Israel and every day, not a couple of dozens as it was. All in all, still looking at this regime, we should remind ourselves this regime continue to form a very significant threat to the region and beyond.
Yeah, definitely. Well, we actually got through a lot of our questions. There's always a few that we weren't able to get to, but thank you so much. I think this is a good time to probably close up. Very helpful, reminding everybody that we're going to be sending out the recording. We hope that you will definitely share it with others who were not able to join us today. And this recording and all of the recordings that we've done with Avi are on our website and provide really good information. We are going to hope we'll work on it now with you and Maya to have another briefing in probably early February or some kind of every few months to help us really understand what's going on in the Middle East. I do want to make sure everyone knows we have our Festival of Lights, Hanukkah Festival coming up. It's free. It's open to everyone. It's on December 7th. There'll be more information about that. We usually get about 1,000 people here, which is phenomenal and wonderful. And then just to close, wishing everybody a peaceful and meaningful Thanksgiving. And just hope everyone enjoys the holiday with loved ones. Take care, Avi. Wonderful to see
You
you.
too.
Take
You
care.
too. Thank you so much. Bye bye. Shalom, shalom.
Lehitrot. Shalom.
Bye bye.